Okay, next instalment of the Butterfly Lion. So we've got a young lad who's run away from school. He hid in the garden of an elderly lady, and while they were having tea, he looked out of the window and he could see a blue, shimmery lion that was almost a shadow, but not quite. And the lady's going to tell him a story about how the lion came into her life, and somebody called Bertie as well. So we're going to hear all about that in this chapter, which is chapter 3. Bertie was born in South Africa in a remote farmhouse near a place called Timvati. It was shortly after Bertie first started to walk that his mother and father decided a fence must be put around the farmhouse to make a compound where Bertie could play in safety. It wouldn't keep the snakes out. Nothing could do that, but at least Bertie would now be safe from the leopards, the lions and the spotted hyenas. Enclosed within the compound were the lawn and gardens at the front of the house, and the stables and barns at the back. All the room a child would need or want, you might think, but not Bertie. The farm stretched as far as the eye could see in all directions, 20,000 acres of veld. Bertie's father farmed cattle, but times were hard. The rains had failed too often, and many of the rivers and waterholes had all but dried up. With fewer wildebeest and impala to prey on, the lions and leopards would sneak up on the cattle whenever they could, so Bertie's father was more often than not away from home with his men guarding the cattle. Every time he left he'd say the same thing. "Don't you ever open that gate, Bertie, do you hear me? There's lions out there, leopards, elephants, hyenas. You stay put, you hear?" Bertie would stand at the fence and watch him ride out, and he would be left behind with his mother, who was also his teacher. There were no schools for 100 miles, and his mother too was always warning him to stay inside. "Look what happened in Peter and the Wolf," she would say. His mother was often sick with malaria, and even when she wasn't sick she would be listless and sad. There were good days when she would play the piano for him and play hide and seek around the compound, or he'd sit on her lap or on the sofa out on the veranda, and she'd just talk and talk all about her home in England, about how much she hated the wilderness and the loneliness of Africa, and about how Bertie was everything to her. But they were rare days. Every morning he'd climb into her bed and snuggle up to her, hoping against hope that today she'd be well and happy, but so often she wasn't, and Bertie would be left on his own again to his own devices. There was a waterhole downhill from the farmhouse and some distance away. That waterhole, when there was water in it, became Bertie's whole world. Picture. I think that might be the watering hole. You just see some animals here in the distance. There was a waterhole downhill from the farmhouse and some distance away. The waterhole, when there was water in it, became Bertie's whole world. He would spend hours in the dusty compound, his hands gripping the fence, looking out at the wonders of the veld, at the giraffes drinking, spread-legged at the waterhole, at the browsing impala, tails twitching, alert, at the warthog snorting and snuffling under the shade, at the baboons, the zebras, the wildebeests, and the elephants bathing in the mud. But the moment Bertie always longed for was when a pride of lions came paddling out of the veld. The impala were the first to spring away, then the zebra would panic and gallop off. Within seconds the lions would have the waterhole to themselves, where they would crouch to drink. From the safe haven of the compound Bertie looked and learned as he grew up. By now he could climb the tree by the farmhouse and sit high in the branches. He could see better from up there. He would wait for his lions for hours on end. He got to know the life of the waterhole so well that he could feel the lions were out there even before he saw them. Bertie had no friends to play with, but he always said he was never lonely as a child. At night he loved reading his books and losing himself in the stories, and by day his heart was out in the veld with the animals. That was where he yearned to be. Whenever his mother was well enough, he would beg her to take him outside the compound, but her answer was always the same. "I can't, Bertie. Your father has forbidden it," she would say, and that was that. The men would come home with their stories of the veld, of the family of cheetahs sitting like sentinels on their kopje, sitting like sentinels on their kopje, of the leopard they had spotted high in the tree, watching over his kill, of the hyenas they had driven off, of the herd of elephants which had stampeded the cattle, and Bertie would listen wide-eyed agog. Again and again he asked his father if he could go with him to help guard the cattle. His father just laughed, patted his head, and said it was man's work. He did teach Bertie how to ride and how to shoot, but always within the confines of the compound. Week in, week out, Bertie had to stay behind his fence. He made up his mind, though, that if no one would take him out into the veld, then one day he would go by himself. But something always held him back. Perhaps it was one of those tales he'd been told of the black mamba snakes, whose bite would kill you within 10 minutes, hyenas whose jaws would crush you to bits, of vultures that would finish off anything that was left, so that no one would ever even find the bits. For the time being he stayed behind the fence, but the more he grew up, the more his compound felt like a prison to him. One evening, Bertie must have been about 6 years old by now, he was sitting high up in the branches of his tree, hoping against hope that the lions might come down for their sunset drink, as they often did. He was thinking of giving up, for soon it would be too dark to see, but then he saw a solitary lioness come down to the waterhole. Then he saw that she was not alone. Behind her, and on unsteady legs, came what looked like a lion cub, but it was white, glowing white, in the gathering gloom of dusk. Okay, so that must be the lioness there. And a cub there. Right, I think we'll leave it there for today.